practical research on various bird species. Cindy has been conducting research in forest birds in Nova Scotia for over 25 years. She retired recently from the biology department at Dalhousie in 2019 and is now an adjunct professor. Before retiring, she spent most of her time at Dal developing and leading its Seaside Summer Field Course program, as well as leading its first-year integrated science program. She also developed and taught numerous courses in ecology and biodiversity, including Dal's new Species at Risk field course. Over the years, Cindy has trained many students, interns, and volunteers, and has led several research, monitoring, and stewardship projects. Work by Cindy and her students laid the foundation for the current forest bird monitoring program at Ketchi. Other projects focused on habitat associations for bird species, comparing birds in harvested and protected landscapes, and examining the effects of riparian buffer width on forest bird species. More recently, she and her students have been focusing on species at risk forest birds, characterizing their habitat needs, and now stewarding these habitats. Today, she will be sharing her work on her latest project to develop and test beneficial management practices for species at risk forest birds in working forests in collaboration with Crown land forest managers. Welcome, Cindy.
Thanks, Don, and thank you all for allowing me to speak today. The project I'm going to talk to you about today is something that we've been working on for the last 2 years with a variety of partners, two of which are Crown land managers, the Woodland Community Forest Co-op, and Fort Hawkesbury Paper. The species we're working on include these 5. The Canada warbler, which likes mixed-wood swamps with the tall shrub layer. The olive-sided flycatcher, which likes mature, moist to wet spruce forests, as well as burns. The rusty blackbird, which you find in wetland stream forest complexes. The eastern wood pewee, which is a bird of the mature upland forest, mixed wood in particular. And the common nighthawk, which actually really likes clear cuts. So you find them mostly in harvested, burned, and sparsely vegetated areas. They will even nest along gravel roads. So the rationale behind this project is that these are species at risk, so we need to try to recover their populations. In order to do that, they need to have access to quality breeding habitat. Now, studies that have been done in Nova Scotia have showed that the bulk of the breeding populations of these species are distributed across the working forest. So there's no way that you could protect enough land to recover these species. Therefore, it's really crucial to work with conservation in the working forest. So the goal behind the project is to work together with the forestry community to find solutions that will benefit both the birds and forestry. The specific objective of the project is to develop and test, using a collaborative and iterative process, a set of operational guidelines for beneficial management practices for these 5 land bird species at risk in the forests of Nova Scotia. Just as we were starting on the project, Katie McLean at Cleonapolis River Project was working on a series of beneficial management practices, 2-page fact sheets for all species at risk. And so I helped her with the BMPs for these 5 species. And we distributed them in 2021. You may have recalled getting something by email at that point. And today, you all have a copy of them in your registration packet. So these were based on literature review and some local input. They were approved by the DNRR and Environment Canada for working drafts to use in the project. But Basically, they're all based on, any details in the BMPs are from other regions, perhaps Ontario, perhaps Alaska. So I think one of the things that we're going to need to do is to look at some of the details and test and see whether they also work best for Nova Scotia. So on the 2-page fact sheet, there's a part on the second page called How You Can Help, the Beneficial Practices. And so we have been drawing from this information in the project that we're working on. So I'll give you some examples of BMPs. So for any species at risk, in fact, any bird, but we're focusing on species at risk, and sort of like it's the first thing we're going to be looking at. We want to avoid silviculture during the nesting season, if possible. Every bird has a slightly different nesting season, and you can look that up in the nesting calendars. Another general BMP that's beneficial to all bird species is to avoid the use of insecticides and herbicides, because these are affecting their habitat as well as their food source. And then for birds that typically are associated with wet forest, and that would include Canada warbler, rusty blackbird, and olive-sided flycatcher, there are sort of general recommendations of working around wet forest. For example, leaving a 15-meter buffer around all streams, wet forests, and open wetlands, avoiding activities that will alter wetland hydrology, like road building. If one is going to harvest, to do so on snow or frozen ground, but generally recommending to avoid harvesting in forest wetlands. And this is your Canada warbler. They nest right on the ground in forest wetlands. Actually, this is redundant. Sorry about that. I forgot to take that out. And then for each of the species, there will be species-specific BMPs in addition to what we've already talked about. So we're taking these draft BMPs. Now we need to operationalize them in the context of forestry in Nova Scotia. So the draft BMPs were really intended as a guide for planning harvest without necessarily knowing that you've got a specific SAR on your property. So there are general ways, based on the literature and studies in other places, how you can maintain or promote the habitat for a particular SAR. Now, because in our project we wanted to actually test the BMPs, we are looking to work at sites with known SAR. Because we want to be able to determine whether the BMPs have retained habitat elements that are needed to support a specific SAR. I'm going to be telling you about the protocols that we use for field work. We did quite a lot of field work trying to find visiting harvest blocks to find if there were SAR present. And then we needed to figure out how to operationalize the BMPs, and we did this in partnership with our forestry partners. And so I would make recommendations after compiling all the field data, present it to the forestry company in the province, and they would revise the harvest plans. So briefly, how did we find the birds? Well, we visited in 2021, we visited over 100 harvest blocks across Nova Scotia. And we were targeting areas that were most likely to have the SAR based on the habitat that was present. If we didn't find the birds spontaneously, we'd use 30 seconds of playback. The males respond aggressively to when they hear the song of their species, so they'll pop out even if you didn't notice them before, if they're there. We mapped out the locations of the birds by, usually you're not standing right next to the bird. So how far away is the bird in what direction? And so we're mapping out the bird's territory. And then we also used autonomous recording units like this audio moth here that you may have heard about. And if you want to see what one of these looks like, I have some with me after the talk. And so we use those at the harvest blocks to detect additional SAR and also to monitor control sites. And one of the things we found is that the ARUs are very useful for detecting SAR. So you don't have to be a bird biologist or a birder to go out there and find them if you have one of these. So basically, 54% of the birds that we found, and this is for the crown lands that we were surveying, were detected only in ARU recordings. And it was especially high proportion were detected only in the recordings for common nighthawk. This is a bird that is active at dawn and dusk, so often you don't see them when you're out of sight. And also for the olive-sided flycatcher and rusty blackbird, probably because they have huge territories. The flycatcher's territory is 15 to 25 hectares in size. Rusty blackbird ranges over an area of a kilometer on a daily basis. So after our 2021 surveys, we sent the information to our forestry partners, and they wrote back and said, well, these are the sites that we think we can reasonably be working on over the next year or so. And so several sites in Medway Community Forest Co-op's area, one West Core site, and 8 sites in Cape Breton, managed by PHP. So the work I'll be talking about now is based on these sites. So this was one of the first sites that we dealt with where we had known locations of the bird and how we're going to figure out how to apply the BMP. So in the little dots are Canada warbler sightings, and the smaller pink circle is a 25-meter buffer, and we decided that would be a no harvest buffer around the bird locations. And then the yellow circle is a 100-meter buffer, so in between the 25-meter no harvest buffer and the end of the 100-meter buffer is where the BMPs would be applied. So the idea is, rather than just applying this across the entire harvest block, we would do it focused on areas where we had found the birds. And on the right side, you can see that those little areas have been taken out of the approved harvest plan, and there's now the little black hatching is the area where the BMP would be applied. This is another site in Cape Breton, and it had I think about 10 different Canada warbler singing males. And so we have, in the beige circles, we have the no harvest buffers, and in the blue circles are the BMP buffers. And then the white outlines are the edges of the harvest block. And we found by looking at a lot of the harvest blocks on Google Earth that the obvious wetlands are not included in the harvest blocks, but oftentimes when you go out there in the field, they're just a little bit too close to the wetland. So the Canada warbler BMPs include retaining trees that the birds need to use as song perches. They need to stand up above the other canopy. You want to minimize disturbance to the ground vegetation because they spend their time mostly in the tall shrub layer. And they nest right on the ground, so you need a very messy site. So they actually really like to blow down. So you would want to minimize disturbance to the ground, vegetation, moss cover, the down woody material, the stumps, the hummocks, and root masses, and trees that have fallen down. To leave tree tops and limbs on site to enhance the woody debris and forest floor structure, avoiding use of insecticides that will impact the insect prey, and herbicides that are going to definitely impact the shrub layer that they need for habitat. And then we also found through doing our very first BMP, which was in southwest Nova Scotia, that you really have to be careful about telling harvester where to lay out the trails so that the trail is not impacting on the no harvest area. These are two other views of that same site, the little yellow diamonds or Canada warbler locations. And you can see the harvest block areas are shaded white. And what you can see in the air photo is that there, you can see an obvious wetland in between the harvest block pieces. And if you look at the wet areas mapping, which is in the purple and brown, it's areas less than where the land has water table within a half a meter of the surface, and also the mapped wetlands, which are those two pieces in the middle, that the Canada warblers are primarily in between the upland forest and the wetland. And they really do like wet areas. We were kind of surprised when we went to this site and we found 7 Canada warblers in an area that wasn't, that didn't look wet, at least by the wet areas mapping. But all of these areas were wet. So in general, avoiding areas where the water table is close to the surface would be a good way to promote Canada warbler habitat. So at this site, we made the same recommendations for Canada warblers, and that site has now been harvested, and we'll be going back in the spring to see how they fared. River Tiller West is also in Cape Breton. It's an area that is a part of a harvest block that is near extensive wetlands. We found 3 olive-sided flycatchers on the block. Those are the green diamonds. 3 Canada warblers. Those are the yellow diamonds. And we recommended BMPs for both SAR. We also found common nighthawks. May have been nesting near the power line and previously harvested areas on the north side. And this shows the BMPs that were recommended for the olive-sided flycatcher. Again, you've got a 25-meter no-harvest buffer around the locations where we found the birds, and the large green circles are the BMP buffers. And within those, we asked them to use unequal age forest management systems to leave clumps of tall trees, especially mature black spruce. Because the birds nest in clumps of tall spruce as well as forage from the tops. Leave all the snags that aren't a safety threat because they forage from the tops of snags. And to avoid the use of insecticides and herbicides. Olive-sided flycatchers love bees. That's one of their favorite foods. And so herbicides are going to be impacting their food source. And this is the same site, the actual harvest prescription, courtesy of Nathan Rankin. And so you can see the places where we found the birds are here in blue and red. And they're, so they had a 10% retention clump was their harvest prescription originally. In the BMP areas, they increased that to 30% retention. And this has also been harvested, so we'll be going back in June to see how the birds, whether the birds are still there, whether they're in the same place, and also flying a drone over the site to then measure what was exactly changed. This is one site in Cape Breton that had a lot of common nighthawks. And for nighthawks, the BMPs are more about, when you're harvesting, how can you create more roosting habitat for the bird? Because They forage it out in dust, but they spend the day sitting on the branch or on a log. So they're like nice big logs. So retaining large, dead and imminently declining trees that will be a future source of large wood debris is recommended. You can also skid back onto the block large culm pieces. You can create suitable nesting conditions by leaving areas of old deactivated road untraveled on, because they can nest right on the road. Limiting insecticides and herbicide use. And also, in case of natural disturbance, the BMPs recommend leaving at least 25% of the areas unsalvaged. Managed by the Mersey Community Forest Co-op, where we had 2 pairs of eastern wood peewees. We found the nest of one of them, that's the pink star in the upper right. We deployed 4 ARUs there, and in addition to the peewees, which we found in field surveys, we picked up common nighthawks, chimney swifts, and evening grosbeaks. These are also species at risk, but as yet we don't, other than for chimney swift, a BMP is basically reading any large cavity trees. And evening grosbeak, we just don't know that much about them. And specifically for the peewee, again, we have this 25-meter no harvest buffer, and then outside of that, we recommended the following silvicultural practices: to maintain large and mature trees. And now these are details from Ontario, so I think we might want to modify that a little bit for Nova Scotia, but large diameter trees and deciduous and mixed wood stands. A total basal area of 22 meters per hectare. And also maintaining gap dynamics and promoting gap dynamics. One of the things we noticed is that we didn't actually have details from the literature for the species in the BMPs. So we need to do more. We do need to do some research on what size trees are important to retain and what gap sizes are ideal for the species. For the Medway Community Forest Co-op site, they basically were marking for retention large ponds that had the structure that the peewees need for foraging and nesting. So an important part of this project is going to be to document the effectiveness of the BMPs. So we plan to resurvey the blocks where BMPs were applied. Unfortunately, only about half of the BMPs that we were setting up to be done, to have worked on have already been done. It's just it seems to be a very long process of planning and figuring out, when a site can be harvested. So we will be looking to see if the birds that we documented previously are still there. If so, then that's evidence that the BMPs worked to retain the habitat elements that the birds needed. We'll be using drones again to document the habitat before and after harvesting. This is something I'm just starting to learn about, how to get forest metrics out of drone data. So if anybody out there is familiar with that, let me know. This is just a slide showing that we also surveyed control sites. This is at the Otter Ponds Demonstration Forest, which you may recognize. There's a goblet-saddle flycatcher breeding site next to a Canada warbler breeding site, and there are common nighthawks using the area as well. So we'll be doing follow-up studies there. Apparently the stand, the red spruce, mostly, if not all, fell down during the hurricane. And I wanted to end with some thoughts on strategies for incorporating BMPs into private woodlot management. So you can, without even knowing for sure that there's a SAR in your land, you can apply BMPs for the SAR most likely to be present based on the habitat. So you can learn to identify the preferred habitat of each of the SAR. If you're associated with the Woodlot Owner Association, then you can probably get access to SAR records. and perhaps habitat models. If you have wetlands, you can simply apply a 50-meter buffer around them, any wetland or stream or vernal pool, and that's going to benefit a large number of species. And in general, uneven aged management techniques will help increase the diversity of the vertical and horizontal structure within the stands and promote starbirds as well as other birds of mature forest that need our help. You're probably asking, well, what if I can't stop harvesting for 2 to 3 months during the nesting season? Well, I think you can still plan to do the least harm. And you can do that by prioritizing sites, stands, or areas that we're going to work on outside of the nesting season to be sites that have SAR or SAR habitat, sites that support mature forest birds, most of which are declining, and even though they're not listed as species at risk yet, and also sites with wet forest or sites that are adjacent to wetlands. Studies in Nova Scotia have shown that forested wetlands and more open wetlands are more productive, have more bird species, have more bird individuals, and more species at risk birds than upland forest in general. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I just want to thank Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Habitat Stewardship Program for funding the work on Canada warbler, rusty blackbird, and feathered flycatcher, the Nova Scotia Priority Place, Southwest Nova Scotia Priority Place for funding the work in Southwest Nova Scotia on common nighthawks and eastern wood, and the Habitat Conservation Fund for work on all 5 species, and PHP for help with the funding for working with the button. Thank you very much.